Hello to all. Thank you very much for joining us this morning or tonight. My name is Éléonore Kissel. I'm head of conservation at the Musée du Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac in Paris, France, and I am a visiting scholar at the UCLA Getty Conservation Program. I wish to thank Ellen Perlstein, who has been mentoring me here, as well as the master degree and PhD students in conservation who have welcomed me so warmly. I want to extend my thanks to my own institution for enabling me to come study here and fully supporting me in this endeavor. I would also like to say that for brevity's sake, few people will be cited nominally during this presentation, including my colleagues from the conservation team. They will be duly acknowledged in any written form of the present talk. I know, and I hope they know, how much they bring to the preservation of cultural heritage collections. Lastly, I would like to say that the views expressed here are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect the policies and practices that will be implemented at the Musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac, as they are for the moment preliminary findings of my research at UCLA. This is Paris. I'm showing you a map from 1910. The red circle points to the space upon which the Musée du Quai Branly Jacques Chirac would be built nearly a century later. The museum opened in 2006. This is where I work, within beautiful surroundings, next to our beloved Eiffel Tower, but also in a magnificent garden, which acts as a vegetal shrine for the museum's exceptional collections. The Musée du Quai Branly keeps approximately 370,000 objects, over 700,000 photographs, and about 11 linear kilometers of archival and library material. The specificity of the Quai Branly collections is their geographic origin: Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. These collections and holdings came from the merge of two former institutions. Most of the photographs, manuscripts, and printed documents, as well as about 225,000 objects, came from the Musée de l'Homme, which had opened in 1937 in an Art Deco building, which you see on the screen. The Musée de l'Homme itself had replaced the Musée d'Ethnographic du Trocadéro, housed in the extravagant building you see on the left, and it had opened in 1878 in Paris in parallel to the Paris Universal Exhibition. Approximately 50,000 objects, my apologies, came from the National Museum of African and Oceanian Art, an institution that mutated from the former Museum of Colonies. This particular museum had opened in 1931 in parallel to the colonial exhibition that took place in Paris that very year. With collections stemming from such diverse institutions, you may imagine the complexity of provenance research and at times the disquieting history embodied in some of the objects. General information about the museum institutional backgrounds can be found in English on the Quai Branly's website, but for now, let me briefly describe some of the museum's spaces, exhibitions, and projects. These are the permanent exhibition spaces at the Musée du Quai Branly. They were conceived in the early 2000s as a large volume in which the visitor can move seamlessly from one geographic area to the other. Temporary exhibitions conceived at the Musée du Quai Branly may focus on a specific geographic area and the peoples who inhabit it, such as in the 2016 Aesthetics of the Amour River exhibition, curated by Daria Cevoli, in which landscapes and objects from Far Eastern Siberia were presented. Other exhibitions showcase emblematic objects, here the Native American wampum, in the 2020 exhibition curated by Paz Núñez Regueiro and Nicolaus Stoller. There are exhibitions on social issues, such as the 2022 Black Indians, which focuses on the African-American population in New Orleans, reflecting upon the way in which the community historically engaged with local indigenous tribes and how it deals today with the memory of slavery and its contemporary social and economic consequences. This exhibition was conceived of by Steve Bourget, curator at the museum, and Kim Vaz-Deville, professor at Xavier University. I would like to end this segment of my talk by discussing collaborative exhibitions. These are views of Goulari, a 2021 exhibition about Aborigines peoples from the land of Arnhem in Northern Australia, curated by Joe Damanidji and Rouge Nalkamara, Indigenous artists, Nicolas Garnier, curator at the museum, and Jessica Delargy-Healy, anthropologist. It was a collaborative process from its inception, but I would like to state that so were Wampum, Black Indians, and several other exhibitions I haven't mentioned. Collaborative exhibitions are not a rare occurrence at the Quai Branly Museum, and they are certainly becoming ever more frequent. This is a map of the world, locating France in Europe in 1550. 2 centuries later, France had colonized an extensive territory in eastern North America, several islands in the Caribbean, and in the northern part of Amazon in what is today French Guyana. In Africa, it had commercial counters in Senegal, the southernmost part of what is today the Republic of Benin, Reunion Island, Mauritius, and in Asia, several counters on the eastern coast of India. At the eve of World War I, with the exception of Ethiopia, both the African and Oceanian continents were entirely colonized by European nations. France had had a large colonial expansion in Africa. Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Sudan, Niger, Mauritania, Ivory Coast, Senegal, French Guinea, Togo, Republic of Benin, Burkina Faso, Chad, Gabon, Cameroon, the islands of Madagascar, Reunion, and the Comoros. In the Pacific, France had colonized several islands in Polynesia and Melanesia. Territorial divisions after World War II, followed by the independencies of African, Asian, and Pacific nations, had changed the world map by 1974. Today, France has no more colonies, but some ultramarine territories are part of its national territory. French Guiana and several Caribbean islands in the Americas, Djibouti, Mayotte, and the Reunion Island in Africa, several islands in the Pacific, including the largest, which is New Caledonia. So France was engaged in colonization on all continents. Today, there is a diaspora of the former colonies living in France, as there are immigrants from countries that were never colonized by France. Of course, France as a nation has diplomatic relations with most countries. And in the Musée du Quai Branly, there are collections from virtually every ecosystem on the planet, which would place the institution in the realm of so-called universal museums. There would be a lot to discuss in relationship to this concept, but as it's not the focus of this presentation, I will move to the questions the conservation team, including myself, are asking ourselves. Should we uncolonize, decolonize, transcolonize our practices in conservation? In order to answer, we have to look at the context in which we are operating. We shall start with our legal framework. Secularism is a constitutional principle that derives from the 1905 law on separation of church and state. It is applied much more strictly than the law which holds the same name in the US. In France, it means that religion is strictly excluded from public affairs, and we shall discuss the potential consequences of this deeply rooted foundational legal principle. Now, regarding museums, there are at least 3,000 museums in France. Among these, approximately 1,200 are registered as Musée de France, which could translate as Museum of France. This qualification is extended to museums that have a building, a collection, are open to the public, and are operated by a team of museum professionals. These museums, most of which are public, must comply to the Heritage Code, a compendium of laws and decrees relating to all cultural heritage sectors, that is, archives, libraries, museums, historical monuments and sites, as well as archaeological sites. Two of the rules in the Heritage Code dictate the way in which museums operate. First, public collections are inalienable, which means that they cannot be deaccessioned unless it is proven that they have sufficiently degraded to become, for lack of a better word, unusable. This, of course, has a high impact on repatriation. As we speak, in order to repatriate any object or group of objects, a specific law must be submitted and agreed upon by both the French National Assembly and Senate. Secondly, the Heritage Code application decrees state that only recognized conservators can intervene on a Museum of France's collection. The implementation of this particular article is supervised by the Ministry of Culture, an ever-present and important governing body within the professional framework which we will now discuss. In 2020, 1,320 conservators who hold a diploma from one of the 4 French schools and universities were in activity in France or abroad. Among the recognized conservators who work in France, about 900, and that's 76%, work independently. The 200 or so professionals working in institutions don't always work in cultural heritage institutions, such as museums, historic houses, or archives. And when they do, they don't always work as conservators. They may hold teaching positions, work for the government, or be hired as registrars. Whereas they work as freelancers or have established a registered business, most conservators enter public tenders, as there are few contract jobs, since museums in France are government-funded rather than through project-led grants. Curators, registrars, and administrators are usually in charge of writing and analyzing conservation public tenders. In terms of preservation, from a broader perspective, there are very few positions dedicated to preventive conservation in French cultural heritage institutions, and most of them are held by registrars. As for collection managers, it is an infrequent title, but nevertheless the professional function exists, often in small or medium-sized museums, and it is typically held by curators or registrars. The reasons why I'm pointing to these numbers is because with so few conservators within French museums, it is difficult to implement strategies or institutional policies about conservation practices. At the Musée du Quai Branly, our professional framework does include collaborative projects, and we are very lucky in that respect. One such large project was initiated by Pest Management, head curator of the Americas, on the so-called Royal Collections of North America, the acronym of which is CROYANS. This project led to many publications and 2 exhibitions, including in 2021 the presentation of 18th century Choctaw objects at the City Library of Versailles. Another collaborative project was headed by Fabienne de Pierrebourg, curator of American collections, with the Wayana and Apalai communities living in French Guiana, Brazil, and Suriname. A current project is headed by Gaëlle Beaujean, curator of African collections, and it focuses on the several thousands of objects, natural history specimens, photographs, and archival documents that were collected or produced during the Dakar-Djibouti Ethnographic expedition between 1931 and 1933. Here's a picture showing a meeting with our Choctaw colleagues during the CROYANS project in September 2022. Such encounters are both constructive and joyous. The conservation team being involved in collaborative projects, my question coming to UCLA was the following. If decolonization is spearheaded by a collaborative project, if it fuels by drawing on the tradition of care that every community has regarding specific cultural belongings, what can we do in terms of preservation? And by that word, I mean the full spectrum of activities from preventive conservation to treatment, from storage to mount making. What could be the way forward within the specific paradigm of the Musée du Quai Branly? One topic on which I think the Musée du Quai Branly can act as a positive driving force is on climatic set points for collections. one of the most fundamental aspects of decolonization in museums has to do with access, and that means loans, shorter long-term, as well as storage or repatriation, such as was the case in 2021, when France repatriated 26 objects to the Republic of Benin. I'm involved as an expert in defining the climatic set points for both exhibition and storage areas in a museum in Benin. And in this capacity, I surveyed the existing collections on site in the city of Abomey and determined the condition of the collection. Basing my proposal on that knowledge, I advocated for climatic set points adapted to the local ecosystem, taking into account energy consumption and costs in a developing country. By refusing the assumption that the Western Northern Hemisphere dogma of 60 Fahrenheit, 60% RH must be applied everywhere, we are in effect decolonizing preventive conservation, as well as aiming for more sustainability. Pest management is a difficult issue because biological agents can destroy cultural heritage, oftentimes at an alarming fast pace. It is stated in much of the professional literature, and it is certainly corroborated by my own experience that rodents, bats, birds, insects, and fungi are, along with disasters, the factors that most endanger museum collections. When trying to decolonize our practices, there are several considerations at stake. The first is what I will refer to as the biological pressure of an environment. When I visited museums in New Mexico and Arizona last fall, I ascertained that in a mostly dry climate, the risk of infestation by, for instance, protein-feeding insects is much lower than the one we have in Paris, not to mention many areas of Central and South America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, India, and Oceania. The biological pressure in many ecosystems is so harsh that a robust integrated pest management plan is needed to prevent irreparable damage. Nevertheless, decolonizing IPM may have several avenues. One of them is reenacting traditional and collective care procedures, as demonstrated for West Cameroon by curator and researcher Honoré Tchatchouan, watching over ceremonial belongings and regalia all year long so that they are fit for use by the community on designated occasions is one of the ways to limit degradation. And this fits perfectly with my own experience in the fact that preventive conservation begins by looking at collections. Another avenue to investigate is traditional repellents which have been in use for centuries in many societies. Lavender and cloves, pricked in half a lemon, are what I've seen in European museums. These repellents are not toxic, but they're not very effective either. And certainly pesticides are toxic. Most efficient insect repulsives and pesticides are toxic to warm-blooded animals, including humans. Such is the case for beechwood creosote, extracted from a bush seen here in the Joshua Tree Desert, which is a natural but carcinogenic substance. There is also the issue of discoloration due to the exposure of some traditional substances, such as vegetable oils. These identified drawbacks should not preclude from using such substances where it may be fit to do so, if only because they may be readily available and locally available to source communities. Quarantine, which is a pillar of IPM, implies sealing off an object from its environment. This comes in opposition with worldviews that hold objects to be living entities, which shouldn't be made to suffocate in a plastic or metallic container. Insecticidal nets could be used more widely than is currently the case. They create permeable enclosures which may, when properly installed and maintained, if not entirely alleviate the risk of infestation, at least limit it to manageable levels. In terms of treatment, recurring to physical rather than chemical disinfestation is a better avenue, as freezing, elevated temperatures, and anoxia alleviate the problem of chemical residues. However, anoxia removes the oxygen from the environment of an object, whether by flushing nitrogen or by using oxygen scavengers, whether as a disinfestation treatment, seen here on the left, or as an anoxic housing, such as the one seen here on the right, it may be perceived as brutal for objects considered as living entities. From a decolonization perspective, modified temperature treatments can take advantage of the local climate and of energy consumptions and costs, for instance, by using solar bagging heat treatment. This is in line with what I was referring to earlier about climatic set points. Another way to take on board cultural sensitivity is to ensure that no bagging is necessary, and it is possible to do so for both freezing and heat treatment, given some modifications to standard practices. We can discuss technical issues about this during the Q&A. Also, whatever the disinfestation technique used, the process can be planned so as to separate objects which for spiritual reasons should not be enclosed together, as seems to be the case at Te Papa Museum in New Zealand. And I'm sorry, I clicked too fast. But what I wanted to tell you on this particular image is that in terms of IPM, there are avenues, but bear in mind that the decisions made in the name of decolonizing our practices may prove to be insufficient to protect heritage because of climate change. Buddhist manuscripts were not attacked by insects when the monasteries were in Tibet at a high altitude and in a cold environment, such as the one you see on the screen. The traditional means of protecting heritage, here the practice of bundling books in fabrics tinted a bright orange color, which have symbolic meaning, but also act as a deterrent for insects, were sufficient. It is when the communities were forced to exile themselves in the valleys of Nepal and in India, in warmer and more humid climates, that insects became a major issue for the monastery's heritage. And this one is located in Pulahari in eastern Nepal. That particular situation is due to a forced relocation, but from a physical standpoint, it is not very different than what is happening today worldwide, which is that heritage in any given location will be affected by climate change. And in the face of these environmental modifications, we are going to have to be pragmatic and exert very thorough judgment about the way we act to protect heritage. Decolonizing storage also raises important issues in terms of access, grouping, or isolation of objects. Access is a major need expressed by source communities. At the Musée du Quai Branly, virtual access is easy, as collections have been online since the opening of the museum in 2006. As for physical access, consultations can be requested to the curators and henceforth organized by the registrar's office. Of course, while diasporas may be nearer, the very nature of the Quai Branly's collection mean that source communities mostly live outside Europe. The question of restricted access is not easily solved either, as for French public collections, it might not be legal to grant access or not, based on, for instance, in the case of Native Americans, tribal origin. This is an issue that needs further investigation from a legal perspective. The second issue regarding storage pertains to the classification of collections, my apologies, which is something we might question in such a way. Why do we group some objects together and why do we isolate others? There are several reasons why one might decide to isolate certain elements of a museum collections. Some are requirements of the institution, such as the so-called Priority 1 collections at the Quai Branly, which are housed in mobile cabinets such as these, so as to be evacuated promptly in case of a major flood by the River Seine. Some demands stem from source communities. They may be political, for instance, when it is asked that objects collected within a certain community are not housed next to the ones emanating from a historically rival community. Others are rooted in spirituality and ancestral tradition, such as are the requests for isolating human remains, sacred belongings, artifacts used in initiating ceremonies, or regalia. Here is the way in which restricted collections are housed at UCLA's Fowler Museum. The drawers are in a secured cabinet with limited access by museum staff and very clear labeling. Handling and or viewing restrictions might be based in ethnicity, gender, age, religion, or belonging to a sacred society. This is where decolonizing storage becomes very complex, as there are logistical, practical, legal, and ethical issues at stake. From a logistical point of view, at the Quai Branly, the possibilities to modify the classification of objects in storage in the present situation of saturation of storage spaces is minimal. The project of a new storage building may provide an opportunity to rethink the classification of collections, but even so, we must bear in mind that the larger the collection, the more difficult it is to extensively modify an existing classification system. Practically speaking, both in Europe and in North America, many museum professions are highly feminized. Certainly conservation is. In France, 83% of conservators are women. And from a legal point of view, handling restrictions may come in contradiction with the laws on secularism and gender equality. So restrictions are not only difficult to implement, they come in deep contradiction with the way in which my colleagues and myself were raised as individuals and trained as professionals. Consequentially, there are no easy answers to the issue of decolonizing storage. As with any situation characterized by a multiplicity of factors, the solution will be one of middle ground. My suggestion is that we start by identifying and addressing first the most deeply rooted taboos, such as the ones regarding human remains in some societies. In the Quai Branly storage room, human remains are isolated in movable cabinets that are duly labeled with frosted acrylic paneling in the front. Similar solutions could be used to prevent visual access to restricted collections, to prevent visual access from restricted collections by happenstance, whether in storage, in exhibition, or online. Housing practices may be easier to decolonize than storage. Working on an item or close to the item level allows us to get around some of the difficulties we encounter when attempting to decolonize storage for an entire collection. What we might be looking at are the traditional ways in which objects are either placed on shelves and or protected by enclosures. This may include positioning sculptures vertically rather than horizontally as a gesture of respect. It may mean choosing organic housing materials instead of plastic, as mentioned earlier for Native American collections. It may also be thinking about how objects were kept in their initial setting. In some Southeastern Asian communities, skirts were wrapped around a stick when they weren't worn. In the Pacific, tapas were usually kept flat rather than rolled. There is a specific and precise fashion in which kimonos were traditionally folded. Accommodating the immense diversity of practices may not be easy, nor result in uniform-looking storage areas, but it is a preservation parameter upon which at the Quai Branly could work. It would mean, to some extent, stepping out of our current ways, but we may be enticed to do so for collateral motives, such as sustainability. For sure, learning about such customs can only be done through collaborative projects, so that a virtuous circle could be set in place. Regarding conservation treatments, the first question is who decides if a treatment should be engaged. The second one is by whom, and the third one is how. Who decides refers to the question of property. Much has been written about ownership of cultural heritage, whether in the field of archaeology, architectural elements of buildings, fine arts, and of course, so-called ethnographic collections. According to French law, the Musée du Quai Branly holds the collections in trust for the nation. It is a common good that belongs to me as to 68 million other French citizens. Conservators, conservation scientists, registrars, curators, we are all entrusted by the nation to make the most adequate decisions regarding conservation treatments. In real life, as in many museums, the necessity for curative treatment is exhibition-led. However, in 2015, a specific line for in the conservation budget was created for individual objects or groups of objects that require, in the conservator's view, a curative treatment. It is the case, for instance, with the 17th century Ethiopian paintings from the Church of Abbas Antonios in the region of Gondar. Treatments are undertaken in full accord between conservators and curators, and straightforward interventions don't go beyond this small circle of professionals. When a project necessitates several points of view, a steering committee is established involving stakeholders from the museum, and on occasion, external consultants such as conservation scientists, art historians, or ethnographers. Conservation collaborative projects with source communities have not been numerous. One that has come to my attention through the museum's historical documentation is the renovation, i.e. the replacement of the skin on an Arctic umiak that had been collected in Greenland in the 1930s. During this project, which was led in 1983, 5 Inuit representatives from the village in which the canoe was initially collected came to the Musée de l'Homme to perform the treatment, recurring to traditional tanning and construction techniques. Today, nearly 20 years after Heritage Code was voted into a law, such a project might raise legal issues, as only conservators are allowed to perform conservation treatments on French public museum collections. This being a situation in which part of the object was remade rather than consolidated, the Musée du Quai Branly would need to engage in a conversation with the Ministry of Culture before implementing such a process. This is why the conservation team at the Musée du Quai Branly engages in workshops destined to make us, and contract conservators or students who work with us, more knowledgeable in traditional manufacturing techniques. So far, we have focused on Native American techniques regarding skin tanning, porcupine quill embroidery, and basketry. This is the way by which we have managed to make conservation decisions more collaborative within the legal and professional framework that are ours. Consultations, some past and some awaiting us, bring together representatives of source communities, curators, and conservators so that a discussion may take place about treatments and no idea is refuted until a consensus has been reached. It was such a discussion with Haudenosaunee delegates that led us to technical decisions about the consolidation of very fragile 18th century porcupine quill embroideries. Although traditionally the quills are attached mechanically to the support and to each other, it was deemed accessible by our visiting colleagues to use, if needs be, a speck of adhesive to attach unraveling highly brittle quills. This is to say that the traditional route is not always the way taken, and that an open discussion may bring unanticipated answers. The question now is, should we, and if so, how may we engage with other communities regarding conservation decisions? Some may pertain to objects such as these. We could discuss with the Mapuche what level of cleaning would seem adequate for these 19th century silver earrings. Other discussions may relate to magical or religious objects. There's no question that the metallic elements on this Congo and Kisi were in a state of active corrosion. The stabilization treatment is not a project we undertook lightly. Conservators and curators discussed the objectives, techniques, and outcomes of the treatment. In particular, the surface aspect after the mechanical removal of the corrosion and its subsequent protection. Might we have proceeded differently had we engaged in discussions with the originating community? This object was collected in 1966, several years after the Congolese independence. How would Congolese conservators, curators, museum professionals, or representatives of the civil society envision the treatment of this figure? Would stabilization be considered fitting or demeaning to the Nkisi? Discussing such matters regarding the conjunction of material and intangible qualities in an object takes time. In this case, it would not be such a major issue, for the treatment of this object was not subjected to the calendar of a temporary exhibition. How do we do it for temporary exhibitions? The conservation team had this experience in the context of the 2022 exhibition Sur la route des chefferies, in which approximately 350 objects from the northwest of Cameroon were presented. The vast majority of the collections belonged to the traditional chiefdoms, most of which have a community-led museum established on their lands. As these objects were not part of the public French collections, a thorough collaborative process ensued. The conservation decisions were discussed online and via email with Cameroonese representatives and the museum's exhibition, curatorial, and conservation teams. And in that framework, non-initiated as well as gender handling or installing restrictions were abided by. A man initiated in a secret society came to the museum to install an elephant figure. Women did not touch sculptures containing human hair. The treatment options were described by the conservators, goals, techniques, materials, such as the adhesives. The Cameroonese proprietors gave directives as to which treatments they opted for, and the conservators followed their decisions. The collaborative project also occurred in view of a repatriation. The talking drum Gigi Ayokwe was confiscated by a French colonial administrator in 1916. It entered the collections of the Musée d'Ethnographie du Trocadéro in 1930 and was on exhibition at the Musée de l'Homme during several decades. A formal repatriation request was deposited by Ivory Coast to France in 2019, and the repatriation process was formally engaged thereafter. In 2022, discussions were engaged between the Musée du Quai Branly's president, the head of heritage and collections, curators of the African collections, the provenance research officer, and the conservation team with an Ivorian committee. This committee was comprised of Ivory Coast's Minister of Culture, the director of the National Museum, curators from national institutions, and representatives of the Jiang traditional chiefs. Online meetings and email exchanges led the conservation team to proceed with the consolidation of the bottom part of the 350 kilograms drum, which had been extensively damaged by insects. The paint layer was neither studied nor cleaned in accordance with the directives of the traditional Ivorian chiefs. Before the treatment began, in November 2022, a delegation came to Paris in order to deactivate the power of the talking drum so that non-initiated professionals could work on it without danger. A specific mount was devised to enable the drum to travel to the Ivory Coast, which was also vetted by the committee prior to manufacture. The treatment and mount were completed in December, and the law regarding the repatriation of Gigi Ayokwe is expected during the coming month. Many other topics fall, some more than others, in the general realm of conservation. Performing condition reports is at the heart of what conservators do, and there's definitely room to learn how to describe both objects and the conservation process in a less Eurocentric way. Playing a role in the revitalization of cultures by giving access to collections and working collaboratively to better understand the production of objects is one of the very positive actions museum can perform. A knowledge repatriation project is headed by Stéphanie Leclerc-Caffarel, curator of Oceanic collections, about the vegetable fibers fans woven by women in the Marquises Islands in French Polynesia. It is going on as we speak at a museum in Tahiti, with traditional weavers doing a collection review with an archaeobotanist, an ethnarchaeologist, and a curator. Renovating artifacts is an action different in its intent than conservation, yet collaborative projects embodying both renovation and conservation have been done here in the US. I'm thinking, for example, of the work done with communities throughout the years by conservator Landis Smith. Reproducing artifacts, with or without the aid of 3D surface scans, by machine or by hand, may be a way to make copies of poisonous objects for ceremonies or to share heritage through duplicates. Visually reconstructing faded objects with specifically tuned and focused lighting may also be a way to provide a sense of the impact that such pieces might have had in the past. Ellen Perlstein at UCLA and Vincent Beltran at the Getty Conservation Institute are testing it out on natural history specimens, but I can think of many museum artifacts that might regain force under focused and controlled lighting. And of course, there is room for decolonizing our practices in mounting, in transporting, in exhibiting, and in giving access for spiritual care. Regarding every aspect of preservation that I touched upon today, the Musée du Quai Branly needs to find a path that is coherent with its national and institutional history, its legal framework, and its team. I recognize that museums can be places of knowledge in many ways, but as a conservator, I cannot help but think that collections are foundational. The images of destroyed cultural heritage, here the fire at the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, illustrate my thoughts. The image of the Ivankov Museum near Kiev, set on fire by warfare 6 days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, also reminds us of the violence towards cultural heritage. We can't begin to have a discussion about decolonizing the museum without taking its collections into account. We are infinitely poorer advocates for access, cultural revitalization, training, contemporary creation, if museum collections are not preserved. Here you see manuscripts that are being dried after the 1966 floods in Florence, Italy. They are Jewish sacred manuscripts. And I think that among their many multifaceted concomitant realities, collections are a basis for memory, one of the many systems of memorizing events and concepts, but it is a system found in every cultural tradition. Collections are also a springboard for dialogue, and they can certainly help us deal with our histories of violence and alliances. A leopard can't change its spots. This is what we hear about museums, that it couldn't possibly be decolonized because they are by essence colonial institutions. It seems to me that it isn't so. Firstly, because while museums are Western institutions, they embody and reflect much more than the sole colonial period, history, and perspectives. They offer more than densely stored collections, closed behind doors, and they can and must be places of curiosity in the best sense of the word, of knowledge and of welcome. So the way forward is recognizing the existence of opposing worldviews and therefore the probability of conflicting approaches. It is advocating that different knowledges can coexist regarding the physical preservation of cultural heritage. And it is being confident in the collective intelligence of stakeholders not to reduce complex issues to binary answers. The way forward is trust. Thank you for your attention.